Hello, I'm Barry Daniel, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any appeal to authority. We are joined today by the Welsh journalist, documentary filmmaker, screenwriter and best-selling author Jon Ronson. He's written 9 books including Then, Adventures with Extremists, The Psychopath Test, as well as his most recent work, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, an exploration of public shaming, in particular via social media outlets such as Twitter. And this is going to be the topic of our discussion today. It's a book full of humour, but I also found it very compassionate, wise, and as we'll see as our conversation unfolds, somewhat brave too. Anyway, hello Jon, welcome to the Middle Way Society podcast.
Hi Barry, it's nice to talk to you. I was just on your website and was happy to see that you see the world the same way I do.
Brilliant. Okay, well let's get started then. So what was it that prompted you to write the book, Jon?
I mean, it was a kind of dawning realization that the world was getting much more polemical, and, you know, hitherto the kind of people I could usually count on to be sort of rational and liberal and humanistic were becoming less so, and were beginning to remind me of the kind of people I used to write about in my previous books. People who were sort of lurching towards extreme polemical thought. And I guess I was one of those people too in the early days. And it's because I was so in love with, this, what I wrongly saw as a kind of new form of democracy, which was social media. So I remember a few friends of mine, the comedy writer Graham Linehan and at the time she was a kind of skeptic podcaster, Rebecca Watson, at the same time both said to me, you've got to get on this thing called Twitter. It had just started, and they were saying, it's. I remember very clearly Graham Linehan saying to me, if the internet is black magic, Twitter is white magic. It was a place where people were being kind and unselfconscious, and were just unselfconscious, and compassionate, and would admit things about themselves that they wouldn't, that they would have been too ashamed or embarrassed to admit, and they were doing it on Twitter. It was like this incredible new community, and I joined it and loved it, and then, out of that I think grew this desire to shame transgressors, because we had created a kind of utopian society, and we weren't going to stand for it if a Daily Mail columnist wrote something homophobic or and so on. And to this day, I know I'm giving a big long essay here. I apologise, but I'll get to the end of this very quickly. To this day, that kind of thing still happens, and that's great. But something else has happened, as a result of that, which is this, desire to be constantly on the lookout for people who aren't like us that we can get. And it happens, every single day. And I would say that this sort of dogmatic, polemical attitude has sprung out from Twitter and social media into mainstream politics. And it's one of the reasons why Donald Trump is now the head of the Republican Party. I think it explains to an extent, to an extent, the rise of ISIS. It's this milieu is affecting the world.
Yeah, but it's also been a force for good as well. I mean, if you think about the Arab Spring, that was in many ways a phenomenon of social media. I mean, it played a big part, didn't it?
Right. So I was going to say, my friend, the documentary maker Adam Curtis, would say that the Arab Spring, people cite the Arab Spring as being something positive about social media, but actually, as soon as the Arab Spring happened, nobody knew what to do, and all the old conservative oligarchs took over again.
Yeah, that's very true.
So actually, the Arab Spring wasn't. But you see positive things in other places. I mean, the outpouring of we're talking on the day after the MP Joe Cox was killed, and the outpouring of grief and people trying to make sense of it and people trying to springboard that into a better world.
Yeah.
And starting up a fund. And, the same thing happened after the Orlando shootings next week. Wonderful things do happen on social media.
Sure, yeah. Okay, well, could you maybe then just give us a couple of examples where it did go badly wrong, where people got very hurt?
Okay, I mean, there was one yesterday. I mean, I write about a number in my book, which happened a year or two ago. Things like Justine Sacco. I mean, I suppose the one that's become the most famous one, partly because of an extract from my book in the New York Times, was about Justine Sacco, who tweeted, "Going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS, just kidding, I'm white," trying to make this kind of South Park liberal joke, mocking her privilege, and then got on a plane, fell asleep, and by the time she woke up, her life was never the same again. She was fired from her job, and so on. One happened yesterday. I've got to say, this one annoyed me so much, and I almost sort of fell victim, to the sort of anger that I'm criticizing in my book. And it was a woman. Let me just find the tweet. Orlando's had a terrible week. There was the shooting at the Pulse nightclub, but there was the murder of the singer from The Voice, and then this little baby, this kid was staying at the Grand Floridian at the Disney World, and an alligator attacked the kid and killed the kid. And a writer, somebody on Twitter wrote, "I'm so finished with the white men's entitlement lately that I'm really not sad about a 2-year-old being eaten by a gator because his daddy ignored signs." So that's what she tweeted. Then she added, you really think there are no fucking consequences to anything? A goddamn sign told you to stay out of water in Florida. Fuck a sign. And then somebody summed up my feelings by tweeting at her, "Tell me more about how a 2-year-old deserves to die for his race and gender. I want to be progressive like you." So, I mean, my initial thought reading that was, this is exactly what I'm talking about. The phrase misuse of privilege, white privilege, white male entitlement, all of this stuff, whilst of course rooted in an understanding of the disparities of society, has become a kind of free pass to tear apart anybody that you want to. And that reached a real nadir when this woman says, basically she doesn't care about a 2-year-old kid dying because her father was a white man. Yeah. She, by the way, was a white woman, and a lawyer, apparently. So when I first read that thing, I thought, this is exactly what I've been getting so angry about the last year, which is, the fact that misuse of privilege has become this kind of free pass to just ruin anybody that we want. Yeah. But then, of course, what happened to this woman was that she was, it was incredibly stupid and offensive and anger-inducing tweet, but she was then just torn to shreds. I believe she's lost her job. She was subjected to, such an onslaught of misogynistic and tweets from men's rights activists and anti-SJWs, as they're called, social justice warriors, as people call them, that she then had to delete her Twitter account and, apparently has gone into hiding. So there you have these two extreme sets of people tearing each other apart, and that's the kind of dominant, the sort of dominant milieu these days.
Yeah. To what degree do you think the sort of relative disembodied nature of social media plays a part in allowing us to somehow switch off our empathy?
Well, I think, certainly the snowflake doesn't need to feel responsible for the avalanche. And, the drone strike operator doesn't need to think of the village that they've just blown up. But I think the other reason is it's all about trying to be good people. She tweeted the fact that she didn't care about the 2-year-old dying because the father was a entitled man, and was her trying to be a good person. It was her trying to show. I don't need to explain. It's obvious what she was trying to say. And then the people who tore her apart thought that they were good people. What I found like over and over again this past year in this exhausting way is that the desire to be a good, kind, ethical, compassionate person is what's compelling, this huge amount of cruelty.
Yeah, it's like that saying, nobody does evil for evil's sake.
Yeah, well, in fact, the psychiatrist or psychologist Albert Bandura has just brought out a book called Moral Disengagement, and one of his points, which is what I sort of noticed myself when I was writing So You've Been Publicly Shamed, is that violence is fiercer when it's done in the name of morality.
Yeah.
It's worse. It's worse when it's done in the name of morality.
No, I agree with that. I think there's an Italian philosopher called Gianni Vattimo. He said that alongside every truth lies the shadow of violence. If you're a crusader, then you've got to have unbelievers or people in the wrong as well.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And it's exhausting, and I find it like truly, and I'm sure you do too, because of because of what your society is about. I find it really worrying because this isn't just about social media. I remember one of the very first talks I gave for So You've Been Publicly Shamed was in Santa Cruz. And there was an elderly lady sitting in the front row who was pointedly shaking her head in disagreement with everything that I was saying during my talk. And then when it came to the Q&A, she immediately put her hand up. And so I said, yeah. And she said something along the lines of, if you're, who cares? If you're going to play with the Twitter toy, then it's your fault if you get burned, because my story was about a Twitter shaming.
Yeah.
But I think what the past, I hope I'm not being too polemical or dogmatic myself, but I think what the last sort of year or so has really taught us is that this is not just about social media anymore. Donald Trump is the Twitter candidate. You could even argue that the fact that the left has got more, I happen to be a fan of Jeremy Corbyn, but or to an extent anyway. But you could argue that the fact that the left has got Jeremy Corbyn as its leader again is like a sort of result of this. And you could argue that the Orlando shooting was influenced by this, and ISIS was influenced by this. And we're living in these. It's almost like this sort of pre-Renaissance times.
So would you say that social media is to an extent this sort of huge confirmation bias generator?
Yes, because it's a kind of mutual approval machine. We surround ourselves with people who feel the same way that we do, and we approve each other. And what comes out of this is this kind of vast amount of confirmation bias. When you stop and think, it's ridiculous. Justine Sacco's tweet, nobody knew anything about Justine Sacco except for what she looked like, which was a blonde white woman who looks like she enjoys going to parties in New York. And then this one tweet, which was going to Africa, I hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding, I'm white. And, from these fragments of information, people, via confirmation bias, drew this entire portrait of this person that just wasn't true, which, ended up with people being convinced as she was asleep on the plane that her father was the South African mining billionaire Desmond Sacco, and her father, and I thought that was true about her right up until I met her in a bar a couple of weeks later, and I asked her about her billionaire father, and she looked at me like I was nuts and said, my father's a carpet salesman. Confirmation bias. I've got a joke in the book where I say that, ever since I first learned about confirmation bias, I've been seeing it everywhere.
that got a belly laugh out of me, that, I remember.
That's my favourite psychology joke. Confirmation bias is rife. And a whole bunch of things are rife. I think it's this, moral violence and just this sort of amateur sleuthness, this idea that we can work out who somebody is on the basis of this tiny information, and we're always lurching towards an extreme. That person is a incredible hero, or that person is a terrible villain. And there are those things in the world, but they're pretty rare. Most of us are in the middle.
Yeah, and in relation to cognitive biases, you also cite several examples of the book how people sort of justify their actions via cognitive dissonance. Now, you were just talking about Justine Sacco, the guy that actually posted it out to a much wider audience. He came out with a phrase to reduce his dissonance. Could you maybe just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so cognitive dissonance, it wasn't really something that I understood. I didn't really know what it was until I started researching this book. But, it's the idea that we find it difficult to have two opposing points of view in our heads at the same time. And so, that's a kind of mentally painful thing. And so we try and find a way to simplify. We try and find a way to kind of shove one of these points of view out of our minds. That's basically cognitive dissonance, right? The guy who started the onslaught against Justine Sacco, he was a Gawker journalist called Sam Biddle, and he said to me, I'm sure she's fine. I'm sure she's fine now, or if not now, soon. She'll be fine. And she wasn't fine. She was crushed, and it's because we see ourselves as good, ethical, kind people. That's what motivates us. Yet we are harming people. We're really hurting people. People kill themselves. I mean, nobody ever writes about the people who kill, there's a surprisingly small amount of stuff written about the people who kill themselves because of social media shamings. Sure. And I think it's part of the same thing. It's because we want to see ourselves as good people. We can't handle the fact that we're leaving, corpses in our wake. And so we just don't think about it. We just pretend that they're fine. Or if we can't pretend that they're fine, we do the next best thing, which is to say, well, they're psychopaths, they're sociopaths. We use dehumanizing phrases. I know of a number of people who've killed themselves because of, either unfair or partly fair social media shamings, and there's almost nothing written about these people.
That's so sad.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, well, let's have a look about maybe a bit more positive side. Following a comment from someone that was shamed, a guy called Jonah Lehrer, you started looking for people who had found a way out of shame. What did you find?
Yeah. Well, actually, I was going to answer that in a different way.
Oh, go for it.
Okay. Well, last night I saw this documentary about Anthony Weiner, the New York mayoral candidate who was done for basically sexting people. And it was so interesting watching this documentary because his point, he was taking this sort of French perspective that, my flawed personal life has got absolutely nothing to do with my, my politics and and he's a good liberal progressive politician. I felt the documentary made a kind of compelling case for that. But I met people who, I think one of the main things to do, and Anthony Weiner did this, and Max Mosley did this, and maybe in this way Donald Trump does this even, is narrow, our shameworthiness lies in the space between who we are and how we present ourselves to the world. And if that is a cavernous space, then you're kind of screwed. But if you narrow that space to nothing, it makes you far less shameworthy. So that means admitting it. Certainly don't lie about your transgression. It means admitting it. It means kind of making self-deprecating jokes about it. So with Max Mosley, for instance, who was caught in what the News of the World called a sick Nazi orgy, when it wasn't a Nazi orgy, it was like a kind of German-tinged orgy. Yeah. Max's point was, everybody knows when it comes to sex, people do and think and say strange things. So I'm not the idiot, you're the idiot for pretending to yourself that that's not true about us.
Yeah. Very powerful. And so he in a sense, refused to be shamed.
Yeah, and that's problematic in itself. I mean, I happen to really like Max Mosley. I tend to always like people who give me access into their lives. I'm a bit biased that way, but it's not always good, of course. I mean, a kind of a sort of inability to feel shame is not necessarily a good characteristic, especially if you're Donald Trump. And
but I suppose it depends on the conditions and circumstances. And that in that situation, it was appropriate.
Yeah, I certainly think it was appropriate with Max Mosley. I mean, a ridiculous kind of prurience, that the mainstream media, it's all, it's a money-making game for people.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think if you're in a consensual sex scandal, yes, if you can find a way to not let them get you through it, then all the better.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you think would happen if we sort of try to give up of the idea of shaming completely? Is there a corner of the justice system that's trying this out?
Yeah, there are. I mean, where I'm standing now, I can see across the Hudson River to New Jersey, and I spent some time in a prison in New Jersey where they were trying just that. They were trying this kind of radical de-shaming stuff. It's literally just a big room, where the prisoners, maybe sort of 30 or 40 prisoners, women on one side, men on the other, two separate rooms. They stay in dorms, and they just talk respectfully to each other, and it's all about kind of respect. It's all about self-esteem and respect, and then what tends to happen when those people are let out of prison and go out into the world, it gives them a real head start. Sort of de-shaming gives people a head start. So I was following that, and from time to time, that's tried in prisons, I think in Britain and America. The problem is that there's such a kind of prejudice against programs like that, because a lot of people's proclivity is to be sort of tough on criminals.
Yeah.
I remember one prison officer saying to me, they don't even want them to have weights because they don't want them getting strong in there.
Wow.
So that's a kind of attitude. But in Britain too, this sort of draconian, no forgiveness, no re-entry stuff that you sometimes hear happening in American prisons. Academically, we think that stuff's terrible. Like, who would act like that? And then when we're shaming somebody on Twitter, we have exactly the same attitude. This person should never be allowed another job. Justine Sacco got a job a year after her shaming. And when Twitter found out, they tried to get her fired all over again.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that kind of draconian, hanging judge type attitude, has become prevalent on the left.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, was it always? I mean, I like to think of the left. I mean, I suppose there was always like an element of it, but I don't know. It feels like it's kind of taking over.
It's hard to tell, isn't it? I mean, there's always been public shaming. I mean, you used to have the stocks at one stage, didn't you? And then, there was shaming in the 30s if you were a single mother. But there's something about social media that seems to have ratcheted it up. But again, maybe we always think things were better in the past. There's a sort of bias going on there as well, maybe. I don't know. Maybe.
But there's a sort of what Bret Easton Ellis would call a sentimental narrative, that, public shaming is a kind of appropriate recourse for marginalized people because, they've got no voice in any other way.
Yeah.
And you can certainly see how that's true when it comes to some kind of rape cases, for instance.
Okay.
But, historically, rape victims have been treated terribly in the official mainstream justice system. And a lot of feminists believe, with some justification, of course, that the way to combat that is to publicly shame rapists on social media.
Yeah.
And of course, that's in many ways compelling. But it's wrong to think that doesn't come with its own problems, because it It massively does.
Sure, yeah. Okay, at the end of the book, at least the hard copy version which I read, you wondered whether, because you'd expressed the unpopular belief that people like Justine Sacco are not monsters, you also might be subject to a tidal wave of abuse yourself. Now this, to a large extent, has actually happened, hasn't it? Could you give us a bit of a flavour of that and how it's affected you? And are perhaps any lessons that can be drawn from your own experience that may be useful for other people when dealing with online offence?
Well, it did happen quite a lot after the piece came out. I tend to think about the kind of ridiculous things that happen, both because it's funny, but also because it kind of, when somebody attacks me in a ridiculous way, and I recount that story to people, it makes me look good. So, at first people were kind of tweeting things like, this all started with Justine Sacco, going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS, just kidding, I'm white. So eventually people started, what was really interesting actually, people just didn't want to handle the fact that they made a mistake with Justine, which they really did. She wasn't intending to be racist. She was asleep on a plane and unable to defend herself. It was incredibly injudicial. And some people were like, oh my God, I can't believe what we did. But but then there were other people that were like, well, Jon Ronson must be a racist. And then, so that's kind of how it started. I remember somebody tweeted, I tweeted, by the way, that Justine Sacco extract in the New York Times isn't a standalone article. It's a extract from a book. And somebody tweeted, oh, now Ronson's saying it's an extract from a book. Like, what's that mean? It was always an extract from a book. And then somebody wrote, why isn't Jon Ronson replying to any of us? And somebody else wrote, because Jon Ronson only replies to men. Oh, wow. But then it escalated, and a false narrative began to form, which was that my book didn't understand gender differences, didn't understand that women have it worse than men, which is just not true. I mean, it was incredibly frustrating to me, to the extent that my wife has basically banned me from talking about it, to see things written about my book that weren't true. And every so often, the other day, it's a year and a half later now, and it's still going on. The other day, a Pulitzer Prize-winning critic was slagging off my book and was saying things about the book that weren't true. So I emailed him. I found his email address online, and I emailed him and said, I've got to ask, have you read the book? And he emailed back, I've been meaning to. Right. And this was a critic who won a Pulitzer Prize. So that, but this is how kind of things are now, which is that a sort of, sentimental false narrative about a story is enough. Like, you don't need to actually read the book. So that kind of goes on to this day. One negative effect I think it had on me was that I became, by the way, I should say in the paperback of So You've Been Publicly Shamed, I've written this new long 10,000-word chapter that talks about everything that happened after the hardback came out. Okay. One thing that I noticed happening to me was that I became like the person who would pipe up every time there was a unfair shaming and like defend the shamee. So I became like a bit of a caricature, I suppose. It was like a hardening of positions, which is what I'm against, yet I found myself doing it.
Yeah, well, I imagine that was very understandable given the circumstances, but have you managed to sort of take a step back a bit now, or are you...
Well, to an extent, although when I see people saying things about the book that aren't true, sometimes I kind of feel the need to tell them to, please read the book. Yeah, sure. Because people who read the book, know that the book is a responsible book. It's only people who haven't read the book who have come to sort of untrue conclusions about it. I was definitely kind of, damaged by this kind of small group of social justice people on the left who decided to try and kind of get the book. And I think it did do a bit of damage. But luckily, only a limited amount, because there was no substance to it, because anybody who then went and read the book could see that those accusations weren't true.
Yeah.
But that's never happened to me before. Like my other books were more, they weren't like kind of explosions in this way.
Yeah.
You know, my other books were just sort of, people just liked them by and large. But yeah, I remember my publisher sending me a card at Christmas saying, just before the book came out, saying, you know, get some rest, things are about to get bumpy. And I emailed him back to say, what are you talking about? And he emailed back to say, well, some people are going to hate the book. And I remember thinking, oh, nobody's going to hate the book. How could they? I'm right. It turns out that being right isn't
enough. No.
Isn't enough necessarily. When ideology is more important. I mean, this is the thing. It's like, you know, we're living in very ideological times.
Yeah.
And when people care more about, you know, an overarching ideology than they do about people or facts or nuance, you know, we're fucked.
Yeah.
And that's where we are now. Yeah.
Well, this brings me very appropriately to my last question about, you know, you talk about sort of fixed ideologies. The middle way, as we understand it, is the idea that we make better judgments by avoiding fixed or dogmatic beliefs about things, whether those beliefs are positive or negative. That then throws us back onto experience, so we're left in this sort of messy, it's a word that you use quite often, messy, uncertain middle. But it's arguably in this messy, uncertain middle that we actually can start to get to grips more adequately with the phenomena that we encounter, you know, whatever they are.
By the way, that the dogs have all started barking.
It's all right. Yeah.
But yeah, I agree with you. I mean, sorry, so where are we going to go with it? Because I agree with everything that you just said.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, how might that relate to what we've been talking about today?
I think it's kind of critical to what we've been talking about. Look, I understand like why ideology can be really important.
Yeah.
You know, huge, great changes have happened in my lifetime. You know, the world is a lot less homophobic than it was, and I think the world is a lot less racist than it was.
Definitely.
And we have ideology to thank for that to a large extent. I mean, I live in New York City, which is this kind of, you know, incredible multicultural place, you know, which really works. You know, it really works. I'm incredibly proud of this city that I live in. For those reasons. So I totally see the value of ideology. And I remember last Christmas I was with Owen Jones and he was like, you know, ideology should be messy and people, I'm sort of paraphrasing him, but it's like, you know, we should be awkward and difficult to make the world a better place. And I you know, I really do get that. But I think what's happening at the moment is that there's such a kind of, you know, people have become so ideological. That's become like such a kind of dominant viewpoint that something's got lost. And what's got lost is humanism. It's understanding the kind of vagaries of human beings, the kind of complicated, messy, unsatisfying, you know, grey human being, grey areas, you know, that human beings are. And I really feel that the pendulum has swung, you know, too far towards ideology and too far away from humanism. And, you know, I guess that this most recent book was my attempt to sort of try and swing the pendulum back a little bit.
Well, I certainly think you've helped in that regard, despite the flack that you've received. I think it's a really valuable work, and I know there's many people in our society that have appreciated it too. So I think it's great you got it out there, and as I said, I don't know how brave you were at the beginning. But looking back in hindsight.
Yeah. Well, I remember. You know what? I remember in the midst of all of this, somebody tweeted me something angry. And I tweeted back and said, you know what, journalism shouldn't be a popularity contest. And you know, he kind of said, well, you know, I'm not saying journalism should be a popularity contest, but that's the thing. It's like, you know, if you're a journalist, it shouldn't be all about being liked. Yeah. You know. Yeah.
Well, on that note, John, it's been a real pleasure talking to you, and thank you very much for giving up your time this evening, and hope you enjoy your takeaway.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it. It's just arrived.
All right. All right then.
Okay, cool. Take it easy.
Bye now.
Okay, bye, Barry.
You can find out more about middle way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.